All right, welcome Rotarians and guests to the 5,400 meeting of this Rotary Club of San Jose. Joining me right now will be Sarah Klisch, who will be leading us in song. As a reminder to those of you who may be joining us for the first time, this will be happening weekly, and it's an opportunity for us to quiet the room, share a moment together as we create this space for community giving and togetherness. So Sarah, like always, I'm going to hide behind you while you sing. Thank you for sharing that. And speaking about our club giving back to the community, I'd like to welcome Richard Alejandro, talk about the Farm Workers Caravan, which you've heard me briefly mention a few times. He'll go into more depth.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to start by telling you about what I've done recently. I was the executive director for the American Diabetes Association for a number of years for Northern California and Hawaii. Before that, I was the president of the Mexican Heritage Corporation, which helped build the Mexican Heritage Plaza for $35 million on the east side. I also swam in the World Masters Championships in Budapest, Montreal, and Riccione, Italy. But way before that, I started my career in farm working. That's me on the right, and that's my sister when I was 6 years old. So I started working in the fields at the age of 6 in West Texas. Conditions were not great, especially housing. We lived in a chicken coop at one time. I had a bed in Texas one time that was made out of cotton seeds, and alacranes used to come out of there. But I don't know, how do you say alacran in English? Scorpions used to come out of there. It was dangerous. It was a bad situation. Luckily, I never got stung. And then there was another time in Florida where I slept on a dirt floor, and there was a horrendous storm, and there was water everywhere. I had to find a 2x12 to put up on the rafters to sleep on because the toads and the frogs were coming in trying to take my sleeping spot. So that was what it was like growing up for me. We picked cherries in Michigan, tomatoes in Florida, cotton in Texas. And we also did some hoeing of sugar beets in Michigan. I think so. My brothers and I we'd go along on our hands and knees, and we would make sure that there was only one plant for each hole as we were going along. While our parents were in front of us with a hole, doing the initial work. And speaking of, you see this picture over here on my left. Those are people hoeing. I don't know what crop that is, but they're hoeing it. So this was not back 50 years ago. This was 3 weeks ago when I was going down a house, and it reminded me of those days when I used to do that. So now these people are still out for my foot. And in addition to being out there having a hard time putting food on our table, there was a catastrophe in Pájaro last December when we had those torrential rains, and the levee broke on the Pájaro River and flooded the whole town. 3,000 people were displaced. They're still having trouble getting back. But now comes the good part. Rotary has an opportunity now to go and say thank you to those people and perhaps take some donations to them. So on August 19th, we're all going to get in our cars and we're going to meet at the History Park at 8 in the morning, 8:30. We leave at 9. And we're going to drive to Pájaro, and we're going to make noise. We're going to have signs. We're going to have horns. We're going to have our voices. We're going to say thank you, because we're going to do a little parade through the fields. Then we're going to come back to the church and unload the donations. And then after that, we're going to go and have a brunch at Jalisco Restaurant. There's a limited capacity there, so if you haven't signed up for the brunch, you should do it as soon as possible. Let me see where I am on my program here. Let's see. So that's pretty much it. So we've been talking about it for a while now, but people say, what is it? What are you doing? So you have flyers on your table right now. You have an iPhone or you have some kind of mobile device. You can just click on the QR code, click on that, and just look for the Fajardo caravan, and you'll be able to register. You'll also be able to register for the luncheon, for the brunch, if you can. I want to thank our president, Karen, so much, because when I first came to her and asked her if we could do this, she was enthusiastically positive about it. I want to thank Fernando, Terry, and Maggie, who's done a great job. She got a table out there. There's no reason why you can't sign up today. Please do so. Thank you so much.
Let's give you another image of what he was talking about there. And then the displaced families as well. I'm going to click through your slides here, Richard. And that's a list of how you can help. Now you'll notice that Maggie put together a wonderful table that looked at some of the dry goods that were being accepted. Even if you have gently used items such as sleeping bags, flashlights, those are all accepted. The only thing that is not accepted that's used are undergarments, but anything else that's lightly used will be welcomed. We'll have donation sites here on the 16th. If you can't make it on the 16th, we'll be at History Park on the 18th. And of course, joining us in the caravan is completely free of charge on the 19th. There is a small fee if you'd like to participate in the brunch and the entertainment following that. But with every good Rotarian initiative, if you don't want to go shopping on your own, we will also collect cash donations that will be used to purchase some of the items off the list that's on the flyer on your table. And then one small note, we are dedicating $500 from the unrestricted presidential fund to help support this initiative, which is incredibly meaningful to past President Fernando and to Richard. So please, please, please be generous and join us in this first initiative of my presidential year. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Please.
Clarifying comment is that the QR code on your table will take you to the donation page. If you want to register for the caravan and for lunch, you need to go to farmworkercaravan.com. It's on the sheet, but the QR code just goes to the donation page.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that clarification. Any questions from the floor on that? Because we really want a robust showing. Think about how spoiled we are every time we're in our air-conditioned home or we reach for the backup item that's in our pantry. Please give generously to these people who are suffering so tremendously while we still get to enjoy the fresh fruits and vegetables and the toils of their labor. Now, quick announcement that's very exciting for me. I'm going to be on vacation next week. I'm going to be with my mom, my dad, my favorite human beings, my sister, Evan and Charlie. We're going to be in the middle of the ocean. We are sailing to, or cruising, I should say, to Alaska. So as much as I'd love to join you, my presidential advisor, Carl Solis, will be leading that meeting. We're going to have Ring the Bell and a very exciting announcement about the Farm Workers Caravan as well. So please join and be thinking about all of those wonderful stories that you'd like to celebrate. And before I welcome our guest speaker today, I'd like to do a special shout out to Deanna Prasad, who I saw back here somewhere. She hosted a beautiful home-cooked Indian meal in her home this past Sunday for District Governor Huang Wei, as well as a few Rotarians. So thank you for that kindness. And in case you missed it in the Mercury News, her College of Adaptive Arts also received a $250,000 grant from the county to extend her apprenticeship program, which was recently approved by the Department of Labor. So big shout out. And finally, when we return in August, I'll be talking a little bit about some of the overhead costs that we pay in order to enjoy lunch in this beautiful room every week. But as a reminder, what I announced last week, the board came together and very generously decided to cover the cost of all parking, whether you have a meal or not, during my presidential year. As a reminder, we simply ask that you park and you think about the four-way test. We're only covering parking for coming to committee meetings, attending social time right after this meeting concludes, but not for other meetings downtown. And then I'd like to say that Arthur Jew, one of our new board members, and a deeply dedicated Rotarian, has very generously offered through Live Freely to donate $3,000 in presidential year 24-25 to also cover the cost of parking. So really methodically trying to eliminate those barriers that prevent us from networking and engaging more fully with one another.
Pull up a
So
seat.
we can walk
They
our
lost the
residents
internet,
along
but it's
the
back now.
in the long term. This interpersonal engagement is incredibly important to our overall well-being and of course our emotional health. So
No, this is our president, Karen. Oh.
guest speaker, Larry Dominatelli, come on up. And we are right on time, everybody.
Thank you, President Karen, and welcome to all Rotarians and guests that are here today. Today's topic is one that has significant media and political attention in recent years. It is an area that impacts people of all color, age, nationality, and political persuasion. Thomas Plante is the Augustine Cardinal Bay, SJ, Professor of Psychology and Religious Studies at Santa Clara University, and directs the university's Applied Spirituality Institute. In addition, Tom is an adjunct professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University Medical Center. Over the years, Tom has published numerous papers and articles and over 29 books, focusing on spirituality, clinical psychology, best practices for college students, living ethically in an unethical world, and the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, just to mention a few. Tom has been featured many times in national public and media publications and was featured in Time magazine as one of 3 leading American Catholics in a cover story on clerical abuse in the church. Today, though, Tom's presentation is not on any of these particular topics. He is one who is an area that he is well versed, and the title of his presentation is The Ethical and Behavioral Crisis of Gun Violence. So it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Tom Plante.
Thank you, Larry and Aaron and all of you for inviting me to this wonderful event. I've always had a lot of fondness for the Rotary Club. I can remember in my hometown of Lincoln, Rhode Island, a very active Rotary Club that did great work. If I remember correctly, I even think I got a small college scholarship from them back in the 1970s. Which helped, to launch my education. So I'm always grateful for Rotary Club. Very grateful for Larry for inviting me. But after he invited me to speak to you, I got a call from the Rotary Club of San Francisco, and they asked me to do a similar talk for them. Actually, I think next week. And then just yesterday, I got a call from the Rotary Club in Santa Clara. And they asked me to do a talk for them. So I seem to be on the Rotary speed dial all this time. I think thanks to Larry. But I think I'm kind of holding out for the Rotary Club of Hawaii. That sounds really good to me. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And I understand we have about maybe about 20 minutes of presentation, 10 minutes of Q&A, and so I'll be efficient about it. Of course, it's hard to adequately address a topic like this in a half hour or less, but we do what we can, and PowerPoint certainly helps us along here. First off, you've heard plenty about gun violence in the press and so forth, and sadly and tragically, maybe some of you have had people in your life who have been victimized by gun violence. And so this is certainly on the hearts and minds of all of us in our country that's struggling so badly with this problem. And most of the debate about gun violence focuses on these issues, mental health issues, concerns about the mental health. Now, as a licensed psychologist myself, and treating patients for over almost 40 years, the issue with mental health, of course, is that so many people have mental health problems. There's an explosion of mental health problems, and the vast majority of those who have these problems do not participate in violence at all. I mean, some people do, of course, but that's a tiny minority of those who struggle with mental health related problems. You also hear arguments about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and exactly what that means. And I'm certainly no lawyer, but you certainly hear a lot of talk about that particular issue. You hear a lot about background check. Should we look more closely to see who should be able to purchase firearms and what kind of background? Do they have a history of violence? They have a history of felonies or other domestic violence or other crimes, what have you. We hear about arming school teachers, which sounds kind of scary to me. I guess technically I'm a school teacher. I teach at Santa Clara University, fine school up the road, and I don't think I'd be very competent with firearms. But we hear about arming school teachers and things like that. We hear about the availability of military-style weapons. Many of these crimes are conducted with military-style weapons, and we hear about, should we allow people to have access to these weapons? And of course, we talk about here about divisive politics. Red states, blue states. Red states tend to be more, pro-gun availability, and blue states tend to be less. But I'd like to bring up the topic of ethics. Now, this is a topic that you don't hear that much spoken about when it comes to gun violence. You hear about all these other topics, but not so much ethics. Now, the good news, at least around talking about ethics, is I'll show you a couple of slides that you can apply to really any kind of ethical problem you have, whether it has to do with gun violence or not. It's very general ideas. So that part's really good. So if you're not particularly interested in the gun violence topic, you can certainly apply these principles more broadly. So first off, there's 5 steps in order to think about ethics. The first is you have to recognize a moral issue or an ethical issue out there. A lot of times people don't. In fact, I teach ethics at Stanford in psychiatry for 35 years now, and at Santa Clara for going on 30 years. And often when I start a course on ethics, I'll say, tell me about what ethical dilemmas you've had in the last 24 hours. And most people kind of give that kind of deer in the headlight look, and they're like, I don't know, I didn't steal anything, I didn't rob a bank, I didn't have an ethical problem during the past 24 hours. But then as the course moves on, and by the time we get to the end of the course, when I ask that question, everybody has a good half dozen things to talk about, and that's what we're going after. That ethical issues are everywhere if you have the eyes to see them. It's sort of like if you're interested in buying a new car, all of a sudden you notice cars out there. Now, I happen to have very old cars my whole life. I've only built 3 cars in my life, and 2 of them I still have. And 2001 Honda Accord and the 2006 Honda CRV. And so if we're interested in buying a car, all of a sudden you notice cars. Or if you're going to do some remodeling in your house, all of a sudden you notice things like windows. Otherwise you don't notice those things. And so we have to have that attitude when it comes to ethics. We have to be able to see the type of issues out there. Secondly, we have to get facts. Not alternative facts, but real facts. We have to kind of get good data, reliable data, in order to make good decisions. Third, of course, we have to consider different points of view. So lots of times people will say, is it ethical for me to do this or not? And often it's not so black and white. It has to depend on what principle you want to use in order to solve your problem, which we'll get to in a minute. And then finally, of course, you have to make a decision. You can't be paralyzed. You have to make a decision and then reflect on your decision and evaluate it and determine whether it's good. So that's the 5 steps in ethical decision making. Now, Winston Churchill famously had said, or reported to have said, Americans will always do the right thing after exhausting all the alternatives. Yes, that is true. Maybe it's not just true for Americans, but it's true with people, because at the end of the day, people always want to act in their self-interest. They just do. They want want to act in their self-interest. Sometimes even when people do altruistic acts, they may be doing it for self-interest. So, for example, sometimes altruism is in the spirit of narcissism. Sometimes, and so we want to be able to find a way that people can act in their own interest that also helps others too. So it's a win-win. Now, this is a slide, one of my favorite slides I give in almost any class or talk, because it takes 2,500 years of moral philosophy and distills it into one PowerPoint slide. So that's pretty cool. I mean, it's like a fine reduction sauce or something where you can fill 2,500 years of writing and moral philosophy into one slide. And so what we have here is different approaches to ethics. And again, you can use this for lots of different problems that you may or may not have, whether it has to do with gun violence or not. First has to do with cultural relativism, which is basically different cultures have different ways of doing things. And we live here in the San Jose area. It's remarkably rich in terms of multicultural backgrounds and so forth. And it's really quite remarkable that as you get to know different cultural groups and so forth, you can see how different groups have different ways of solving problems. And we need to be thoughtful about that, respectful of that, and have some cultural humility when it comes to interacting with different ways of solving problems. Second, virtue. This is the one that's most notable, or the one that most people are aware of. This is things like honesty and integrity and being kind to others and things like that. The virtue approach to ethics. Utilitarian is basically what's going to create the most happiness for the most people. It's kind of like democracy. We'll all vote, and whoever gets the most votes will go with that decision. Rights, the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then we debate other kinds of rights. Do you have a right to own a gun or a military style weapon? Do you have a right to housing? Do you have a right to food? Do you have a right to marriage and so forth? Justice, what is just, fair, common good. What's in the common good? And again, this is the dilemma that we have around gun violence, but also other topics too, is this balancing act between individual rights and what's in the common good. So the contract, those are informal rules that we follow. That there's nothing really necessarily written down, it's not a law, but you know, for example, that when you go to a busy place, you have the rule of first come, first serve. You go to Starbucks or something and there's a line, or you wait in line, or you want to go to a nice restaurant and make you have to make a reservation ahead of time because it's sort of first come, first serve. Then we have egoism. Now, this is the one that I think is the most interesting in our list. And this is the one I think we want to pay attention to, because at the end of the day, people will act in self-interest, or they will consider acting in self-interest. We have to be okay with that. So, for example, for years and years and years, about 30 years, I've been teaching these ethics classes, and the students will ask them what kind of ethics dilemmas they will have, and we'll talk about it and problem solve in the class. And inevitably, I think in 30 years, always, 100% of the time, not even like 95%, 100% of the time, people will consider the egoism approach or the self-interest approach. They may or may not act on it, but they will consider it. And so we want to be aware of that. How can self-interest serve the greater good? And so egoism is basically what's in it for me? What's in my best interest? And then finally, we have absolute moral rules, which are rules that you never violate. If you're familiar with moral philosophy, the classic example in this regard is Immanuel Kant's famous example where someone is running, let's say, into this room. Let's say someone is running into this room and they look scared and they run out that door over there. As you can tell, there's 4 entrances or exits in this room. And then 5 or 10 minutes later, another person comes running in with a hatchet and they said, "Did you see so-and-so? Where did they go?" Do you tell the truth? If they went that way 5 minutes ago and you can catch them, or do you lie to save a life? Do you lie? Well, I don't know, I haven't seen them. Well, the absolute moral rule approach would suggest you always tell the truth. It's an absolute moral rule, regardless of consequence, you tell the truth. Well, there's a problem with that. And so absolute moral rules are things we do all the time. We don't think about, we just do all the time. So this is basically the tools that we want to take in our toolbox to think about ethical problems and including gun violence problems. So this is my shameless plug for my ethics book. We talked about 5 virtual approaches to ethics: respect, responsibility, integrity, competence, concern. You can look at a lot of codes. You may be familiar. For example, even this code we have here for the road. Now, first, is it true? It's an integrity issue. Is it fair? These are virtue ethics, right in front of us. Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all with concern? That's the common good. You've got virtue ethics right here behind the podium. And this is an approach that a lot of organizations will use in order to say, this is who we are, and this is what we're about. So when it comes to gun violence, this is how I think we want to think about it now that we've got the context of ethical decision-making and moral philosophy. First off, we have to ask ourselves, what are the facts? What's the information out there that's available to us to make good decisions? So we have to look at evidence-based and public health best practices. So for example, as we all know, as we lived through the pandemic over the last few years, there was a lot of discussion about how we should handle it. Should we wear masks, not wear masks? Should we get vaccinated? Should we not get vaccinated? And everybody seemed to have an opinion about all of this. And sometimes this kind of fell along, political party lines. Red states would do one thing, blue states would do another thing, just sort of like with the gun violence. I don't know about you, but I wanted to hear from the public health experts more than anybody, people who have data around best practices in disease prevention. Now politicians and others, and I know we have politicians in the room and all that. I'm sure they're really smart and talented and all that, but they may not be public health officials. So what is the evidence? What are the best practices that are out there that we can learn from? That's getting the facts. And try to do it in a somewhat neutral way, as opposed to, the way humans work. If you look at the research and cognitive science, for example, people tend to have a conclusion, and then they look for evidence to support the conclusion. And we do this all the time about all sorts of things. We have a conclusion that we filter data to support our conclusion. But we have to be careful with that. Science can't work that way. And public health science can't work that way. We have to have a neutrality around as we evaluate the data. That's the first thing we have to do. Second thing, can we pull a page from the playbook of success stories? Success stories. So for example, there are some countries in the world that seem to have good success around gun violence. New Zealand, Australia. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have some gun violence. I mean, it was just last week, New Zealand and Auckland had a shooting where several people got shot and killed. So it's not like it's perfect, but can we look around and pull the page from the playbook of others to try to make good decisions? It's kind of funny. My wife and I took our very first vacation since COVID. We just got back from Ireland. We spent 2 weeks in Ireland. Terrific. Loved it. We had a wonderful time visiting, and with some Irish blood in me, it was particularly compelling. And my wife kind of noticed that, the food in Ireland isn't quite as good as France or Italy. It's not bad or anything, but it's just, and we were having this conversation. We were saying, when it comes to food, I don't know about you, but I don't know. I think the Italians really win, and the French are not far behind. And certainly growing up in the great state of Rhode Island, where I came from more of an Irish Catholic background, we always envied the Italian Catholic because their food was so far superior. And so they was there a way to kind of pull a page from the playbook, what are they doing right? And then when you look at other countries, you probably heard that joke, you want the Swiss to run the trains, you want the Italians to, make the meals or something, and everybody has something to offer. But some people do certain things better than others, and can we learn from them? So can we look around the world and look at best practices that are already available to us by just pulling a page from their playbook? So that's the second. Now, the third thing is this political conflict of interest. Now, again, I know that there's some people much more knowledgeable about politics than I teach psychology and religious studies. I can tell you how I feel about stuff, but when it comes to politics, I know there's some people who are more expert than I certainly in the room. But one of the challenges we have with our American politics has to do with the balancing the common good with placating donors and special interests, as you know. So as you know, the politicians, they take money from special interests, and there's some expectation about what should happen given that you're going to take money from those special interests. I kind of jokingly say to my students that maybe I should take a page from the playbook there and in my classes and put a tip jar in my classes and say, well, if you want an A, put more money in the tip jar. I'm just going to do that. So we have a problem with this conflict between conflicts of interest from the common good versus placating donors or special interests. And then finally, at the end of the day, we have an ethical conflict between egoism and the common good. Egoism is, I want something. I want a gun. I want whatever. Versus, is that really in the best interest of all? Now, to be fair, I am not a gun owner. But during the middle of the pandemic, as you may know, there was 20 million gun sales to previous non-gun owners. People were scared. I was scared. Maybe you were scared. The summer of 2020, we had the pandemic going. We had the fire going. We had the heat going. We had the protests going. We had the Orange Day, the San Francisco area going. We were scared. So it's certainly understandable. But at the end of the day, we have that conflict between egoism and the common good. So Karen's on the stage. Time to end this wonderful presentation. And we focus the Q&A.
Before you even said something, I was looking at your 9 approaches to ethics and found that virtue, justice, social contract, and common good mirror our 4-way test. So that was just spot on for this purpose. Who's got questions? Past President Fernando, I see you back there. We'll start here.
Thank you. That was very useful and very interesting. The issue has to do with these fake news. We have doctors that say you need vaccines and you need to follow certain protocols. And then you have other doctors who seemingly are equally qualified and competent that say the opposite. Right? And so how does that approach, how would you approach that issue?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. I'm so grateful that you asked it, because we have to understand that science isn't perfect and the interpretation of science is never perfect. You could get 10, internal medicine physicians or 10 infectious disease experts or whatever around the table, and they're not all going to agree. You can get a pathology report, whether something is cancerous or not, and maybe 10 pathologists will say it is, and 5 pathologists will say it's not. And that's just the way science and the application of science works. So what you have to end up doing is looking at the best available data and look at the consensus among the scientists. And so you're absolutely right. You can get people that will disagree. They interpret the data differently. And so that's why we need a consensus. So that's why, for example, I was on, for example, this committee with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services around how to be, how best strategies to deal with LGBTQ youth. And we had a committee of about maybe 14 people or so, physicians, psychologists, lawyers, variety of people. We didn't all agree on stuff. And there were some things we adamantly disagreed about stuff. And that's the way it works. So you have to kind of look for a consensus. It's not perfect.
Oh, that's a great answer.
And I saw someone back there, yes.
Well, the City Light Theater Company. I'm most interested in the issue of civil discourse with regard to gun violence and whatnot. Well, virtually everything. So my question to you is this: what do you say to somebody who simply does not accept fact or expertise? Or
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm glad to bring this up. We actually have a story about that too, because, you know, believe it or not, for a number of years, I was in charge of civility for the American Psychological Association. Now, you wouldn't think that a bunch of psychologists would need anybody to manage civility, but yes, they did. And I get a lot of pushback for it. So you're absolutely right. People will, because they're so adamant about their point of view, they absolutely refuse to listen to other points of view. Now, as you know, I teach at Santa Clara University, a fine Jesuit school that's been around for, you know, over 150 years. And the Jesuits have a brilliant way of thinking about it. There's a three-step process. First is accommodation, which basically means, can you get into the head of the other person to understand where they're coming from? You may not agree with them, you may not like them, you might want to punch them, but can you understand them? Can you accommodate? So accommodation is the first step. Second step, humility. Can you approach people with humility? That's often hard because we often don't tend to be that humble. And so sometimes we think we have the answers, but can you approach people with humility? And then the third and final step is the expectation of goodness. Can you believe and see the goodness in others, and can you kind of pull it out of them? Now, sometimes they misbehave, sometimes they act terribly, so forth, but can you find the goodness, that divine spark, that sacredness, that something in there that you can kind of pull out? And so can you practice basically accommodation, humility, the expectation of goodness, and can you find something that you can kind of be in solidarity around? You know, is there something that is, where's the connection? Can you do that? So I'll end that.
Which sounds like a healthy dose of emotional and social intelligence is necessary, finding that empathy and that commonality. Big boss.
Intergovernmental panel on climate change in the United Nations. It tells us that we're within 10 years being beyond the point in terms of warming. Yet most of the people in the world, the vast majority of people in the world, are not paying attention to this issue. How do we make focus on the most important issue in terms of the English life?
Yeah, no, that's a fabulous question, of course, and the one that I'm sure is on all of our minds, right, is climate change. And we're seeing right before our eyes how the climate is changing in such a significant way, even as we speak. We know about all these heat domes across the world. I just got back from Phoenix, actually. My son's long-term girlfriend just started medical school at the University of Arizona, and we went to the white coat ceremony, which was just fabulous, but it was 116 degrees down there. I mean, luckily we have a miracle of air conditioning, but 106, I've never experienced 115 degrees. It was toasty. And so the world, of course, is changing. The climate scientists tell us it's man-made and driven, and we're in deep, deep trouble. But again, this is a good example of egoism versus the common good. We tend not to want to give up our cars, our airplane rides, and all the other things that contribute to climate change. At the end of the day, individuals try to do what they can. But, you know, there's only so much individuals do when you really need the global response, which we're really just not getting. And so I certainly don't have an answer for that. But I think we can think of climate change as that, again, that balancing act between the common good and egoism. What are we willing to give up in order to have a more sustainable climate? And how do we adapt? How do we adapt? Because I think part of the issue here too is at the end of the day, we all have to find a way to adapt to this changing climate. And that's going to be easier for some people than for other people. I mean, some areas like Bangladesh are going to be underwater, right? And other low areas where migration is going to be especially that, right? Because, you know, people can't live in so much part of the world. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think ethically we can look at it in a similar way, common good versus egoism.
I feel the future is bright in our interactors' hands, though. They'll have a good handle on what to do about this. We have time for one very brief last question, if there's any more from the floor. Well, Dr. Plante, thank you very much for that wonderful. Thank you. A donation has been made in your honor for today's presentation to Loaves and Fishes, because if you're hungry, nothing else really matters, and it's difficult to pay attention to everything else in life. So thank you for sharing your expertise, truly enlightening, and I think we can all walk away with some messages of what to learn. And again, the power of empathy, connectivity, listening, and making sure we can put ourselves in other people's shoes. Next week, we'll have Scott Harewold talk about real crimes. I understand that there is a close relation to another Rotarian here in this room. So we'll be looking forward to welcoming Sarah Janigan's spouse to share a few words with us. And then my final thought of the day, because Winston Churchill was part of his presentation, is the art of diplomacy is telling someone to go to hell in such a way they ask directions. So have a nice week. I'll see you.